Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining with us. Oh, sorry. Okay. That will be my only quote of today. Like I said, really long day after the publication of the journal. Okay, so hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm very happy to be here talking with Jeffrey Mason and Carl Peterson about their paper entitled The Honduran ZEDE Law, From Ideation to Action, which was published in the second issue of the Journal of Special Jurisdictions. How are you, Jeffrey? How are you, Carl?
Very good. Thanks for having us.
Very well. Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks for being here and thanks for submitting to the journal. We've received so many nice comments about this paper that is really a pleasure to have it there. So why don't we start by you telling our listeners or viewers what your paper was about and what are the ZEDEs?
Sure. So with this article, what we really wanted to do was have all in one place, and in a way that was tried to be as rigorous as possible. Sort of the backstory of the ZEDEs, where this idea came from, what happened, how it got to the point it was at when the article was published, how they were being developed, all of this kind of thing. As well as an analysis of the law itself. So not just, here's the sort of big picture idea what this is, but concretely what does the text actually say? What does this actually do? As well as analyze some of the different critiques and criticisms that have been leveled against the ZEDEs as well. And so we wanted to do all of that sort of comprehensively and in one place because we didn't really feel like something that had all of that all together really existed yet. So we wanted to fill that gap.
Yeah, and you certainly did. You go through the whole history, through present day objections, which I found like a very nice storyline. And before going into specifics of the history and more the legal framework that we definitely want to talk about, what are the ZEDEs?
Sure. So the ZEDE law, which is for zones for economic development and employment, or ZEDE, is a special economic zone regime that was created in Honduras in 2012. That really sort of goes beyond any sort of special economic zone or other special jurisdiction in terms of devolving a really expansive set of powers of governance responsibilities down to essentially a municipal level, and sort of created this general framework in which these jurisdictions could be founded in Honduras, and within a certain set of guidelines and parameters, could create legal frameworks that were really conducive to generating investment and innovation, entrepreneurship, and sort of drive the Honduran economy forward that way. And in a nutshell, that's what the ZEDE program set out to do.
Perfect. Anything to add, Carl?
I think Jeff kind of really nailed it pretty well there.
Cool. And yeah, I guess it's one of the first times that municipalities have the ability to get to that level of permissiveness in a way, but but I think it even goes one step further because it's not just municipalities in the traditional way that we know them, but private actors play a really important role there. So can you tell us a bit about that and what makes it so unique?
Yeah, what's I think is really interesting here with the ZEDEs is that it would essentially allow for these zones in effect to be operated privately. Although, right, they operate privately, but they sort of, in doing so, function in the way that a government would, in that they sort of have to provide sort of services and public goods, in addition to sort of the private functions that you would expect from maybe something kind of like a real estate development, where you would ideally be generating some kind of returns. But I think the idea there is, a private development has the right incentives in place to create a successful jurisdiction over time, because that's how they maximize their return. If you create a new city, charter city, whatever you want to call it, that nobody wants to invest in, or that nobody wants to move to, that's obviously not going to be a successful venture. And so the idea there is that, by creating a system like this, you can sort of try to create investment, create a place that maybe affords Hondurans opportunities that might not exist elsewhere in the country, and really tries to get the Honduran economy moving in ways that sort of might not be possible through just sort of the standard sort of policy channels and debates.
And how was this framework possible? Because I know that there were, and you described this very beautifully in your paper, all the legal history from the constitutional level to the final framework. Can you talk a bit about where it all started and the previous REDS framework and what's the difference? Those are probably a bunch of questions, but yeah, just focus a bit on the history.
Sure, I can give some of that background, and then maybe Carl can touch on some of the elements of the law itself. So within sort of the Honduran government, there had been a couple folks that were sort of interested in sort of these ideas about special jurisdictions, innovative governance, special economic zones, and trying to think about for a long time, how can we implement these kind of things? How could we try this out? And then at the same time, in roughly 2009, economist Paul Romer, eventually become the chief economist of the World Bank, won a Nobel Prize in economics, came up with this idea of charter cities. The idea being essentially what I described before, where you can sort of establish a special jurisdiction, where you can build a new city that operates under new, better governance, and that creates development and prosperity. And so Romer teamed up with some of these folks in the Honduran government, and they passed in I believe it was 2011 the precursor to the ZEDE Law, or REDS, Special Development Regions, and functionally very similar to the ZEDEs, what they ended up being. And there was to be sort of what's called a transparency commission that in theory was going to be headed by Romer and some other sort of international development and business professionals, and they would kind of oversee these REDs that were to be set up. And then there were sort of some behind the scenes disputes between Romer and some of the folks in the government, and basically the RED program ended up falling apart. Romer and these first couple members of this transparency commission pulled out. There was a private deal in place to develop a RED that the government had started to broker, that the Transparency Commission hadn't really known about or been involved in, and that kind of ended up falling through. And then shortly thereafter, the Honduran Supreme Court ruled that the RED statute was unconstitutional, essentially on grounds relating to sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country. And so after that, a new law gets passed in 2012 that aims to remedy some of these issues that the Honduran court had previously raised with the RED law. Maybe Carl can sort of get into a little bit of that, about what the actual difference was this time around.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are kind of three articles that ended up getting amended when ZEDEs went through to replace REDs. So, like Jeff sort of mentioned, there were some issues that kind of related to sovereignty and territorial integrity that were the causes of why the original RED legislation got struck down. So when the ZEDE legislation was passed, they kind of passed it with some constitutional amendments as well. And these constitutional amendments dealt with 3 articles of the Honduran Constitution primarily. So the first one was Article 294. Article 294 deals with the subdivision of a Honduras into, the way it's politically organized. Like you'd think of a provinces or states, right? In terms of how it was amended, it was amended in a way that clarified the zones were in fact part of Honduran national territory and that they couldn't be alienated from Honduras, right? So it sort of clarified that you could not, create a ZEDE or a special zone and then to remove it from Honduras as a political unit, right? So despite the fact that these zones may have greater autonomy, they're still part of an integral part of Honduras. So the second, excuse me, the second article that got amended there was Article 303. This article creates independent courts and lays out the basic court structure in Honduras. And the amendment allowed for the creation of a special court system within the zones, within the ZEDEs. Creating a special court structure and legal system provided the zones with greater autonomy because they're sort of no longer tethered to the Honduran legal system. But by amending the article of the Constitution, it allowed it so that this wouldn't be an issue that could cause sort of constitutional tripwire and create a constitutional conflict of interest with the legislation, which kind of goes into greater detail about how an independent court system can operate within the ZEDEs. And the third article that got amended with the ZEDE constitutional amendments there was Article 329. And Article 329 addresses economic and social development in Honduras. And so amending this article sort of painted the zones in maybe a less radical light than had been done with the previous RED form of the law. And so this sort of helped avoid the appearance of the article being in violation of Article 374 of the Honduran Constitution. And Article 374 is the article of the Honduran Constitution that prohibits any amendment of the Constitution dealing with either the form of government or the national territory of Honduras. And so by sort of doing those 3 amendments to the Constitution that fundamentally didn't change a whole lot in the Honduran Constitution, it really just sort of maybe clarified or solidified things in a way that made, the ultimate, the follow-on ZEDE law that got passed with these amendments such a manner, it was done in such a manner that this wouldn't cause any problems with the Honduran Constitution. Effectively, all 3 of these amendments just clarified that yes, ZEDEs are part of Honduras. No, ZEDEs cannot get their own sovereignty, and nothing within the ZEDE law is an effort to remove territory from the country of Honduras.
I was so engaged. For me, you could have continued talking 15 minutes more. Okay, and so how different is the ZEDE framework to the REDS framework after how different in those 3 specific points it is?
Yeah, how different it is, I think that fundamentally it's maybe not hugely different. I think that really a lot of this ended up just sort of being sort of clarificatory. I'm certainly, I will clarify, I will go ahead and say that I'm not a Honduran legal expert. I am a lawyer, but I do general work with special jurisdiction law. So in terms of the ultimate Honduran Constitution and maybe perceptions among Honduran lawyers about how different they are, I can't speak to that. But certainly in my reading, they still seem relatively close to each other. but maybe with more clearly delineated boundaries that, like I said before, really sort of reiterate that ZEDEs are part of Honduras, an integral part, whereas maybe the red legislation was worded in a way that maybe seemed certainly appeared to be more radical, with the verbiage of causing confusion among certainly among maybe observers, and certainly concern among the Constitutional Court, that a red might be able to gain its own sort of sovereignty, whereas the ZEDE legislation really clarifies that that's not the case at all.
Okay. And in terms of the court system, which is a very important and one of the most attractive things that the current, at least some of the ZEDEs have, how much did it change? Like how was before, how is now?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the court system is definitely one of the most interesting parts of the ZEDE law generally. So if you look at the ZEDE law, the ZEDE law is broken into different chapters. So in chapter 3, which deals with the administrative structure of ZEDEs, there's a section on dispute resolution and internal security. And my personal opinion is that this is the most interesting section of the law, because it certainly is maybe more of a broad approach to special jurisdiction, both court systems and security, than you see generally with special economic zones. And the first sort of aspect of that, like you said, there is the courts. So what the ZEDE law does is it allows the courts to have a substantial degree of autonomy in a number of things, and I think these things are primarily one, the type of law that's used, so common law versus civil law. This is a podcast for a journal, so I think that probably many of the watchers and listeners are familiar with the difference between civil law and common law. But if any listeners are not familiar with it, common law is what we like to call quote judge-made law. So a lot of times a court, or the way it works effectively is a court case will happen. A judge will make a decision that sort of creates a rule, and then that rule ends up sort of binding future judges to that judge's decision. You can have a judge, depending on the court system, sort of override this rule after a long time if they give a good enough reason through the appeals process. But that is a common law system. Under a common law system, you sort of have the law develop and evolve over time sort of organically. Whereas in a civil law system, all of the law is passed by a legislature, whether it's a parliament or a Congress or whoever, signed into law by an executive, and judges kind of say, yes, this is legal, no, this is not legal. Some civil law countries ultimately have legal systems where they have sort of guiding court cases to sort of clarify things, but the majority of them don't really rely on those cases, and that they aren't controlling law. They're sort of like advisory opinions that are referred to by judges, where the judge kind of looks at what the law says. They say, yes, this seems to be in the law, or no, it doesn't seem to be in the law. And that judge's opinion doesn't have any effect in the future, the judge's decision there.
It requires an actual like a legal change involving the legislator for it to become. Sometimes judges' decisions do start movements, like legal movements, in civil law countries, but then it's not because the judge says it, it's because then, okay, yeah, a bunch of political parties get together and the civil society. So
there's sort of so civil society or legislators are upset or unhappy with the judge's decision, and so they get all the legislators to pass the new law that supersedes the old law and exactly. Will cause future judges to make decisions that they prefer, right?
Yeah.
But what's really interesting about the ZEDEs is in a ZEDE can choose to adopt a common law or other legal system. Certainly subject to the Honduran Constitution's Article 329. But this is very interesting because this effectively allows a ZEDE to adopt a common law system. It turns out that a lot of businesses prefer common law because common law, what it really does is it really allows business people to sort of predict what will happen to them. This is especially true in common law jurisdictions where there's a lot of judge decisions. So if you look at the US, in the US, businesses, if you're incorporated in one state, you can kind of do business in any other state in the US, so long as you jump through certain hoops in other states that you're not incorporated in. And my example here will be Delaware. I think something like 50%. But let's not give you the number. I won't give you the number there. We'll cut that out. Yeah. Number, I think even possibly a majority of businesses, corporations in the U.S. are incorporated in Delaware. This is especially true among publicly traded businesses.
Yeah.
This is because Delaware has a long history of established law. That's one of the main reasons. Because a business can then look at the law in Delaware over a couple hundred years, over numerous decisions made. A business can sort of predict what will happen to it if it makes a decision one way or another. There are other states that also kind of have this advantage. California has some degree of advantage to this. The state of Wyoming has maybe slightly friendlier rules around certain things. So Wyoming is kind of the up and coming competitor to Delaware, but the majority of publicly traded businesses in the U.S. are still incorporated in Delaware because of the common law depth of judge-made decisions, right? That's one reason, though, why businesses like to choose common law countries over civil law countries to be incorporated in. So as a result, you have lots of international businesses conducted in common law jurisdictions. So whether it's the U.S. and Delaware, whether it's in London and the U.K., whether it's in Hong Kong or Singapore and in Asia, a lot of businesses like to have their business conducted in these jurisdictions because they know generally how judges will sort of rule on certain business dispute issues. So by being able to adopt a common law system, a ZEDE is basically positioning itself in a way that it can try and take advantage of this preference for a common law over civil law for conducting business. And certainly there's a history of jurisdictions or countries adopting, just completely outright adopting whole cloth the law of other countries. A good example for this is Singapore, which for a number of years was using the business law of the UK to the point where they were using it like alive. Like if a new law or new decision was made in the UK, that would be in effect in Singapore that day as well. And Singapore eventually, I think in the early 1990s, stopped this, and this went with Singaporean court decisions as opposed to decisions in the UK. But certainly decisions in the UK can still bear some sort of influence. It might influence the decision of a judge in Singapore. But there's certainly nothing to stop a ZEDE from adopting a sort of a similar approach early on, if they want to just effectively use a body of law that's well recognized internationally and preferred internationally. Certainly something that a ZEDE could do. In terms of other interesting things, maybe that the chapter 3's section on dispute resolution and internal security does. It also kind of requires the ZEDEs to have their own internal security organs, right? Whether these are police or sort of penitentiary bodies, but it also requires the ZEDEs to link any sort of security strategy with the Honduran government's security strategy overall. Fundamentally, how this works is sort of a case-by-case basis. I think that this is something that has the potential to be more interesting in the long term than it probably is functionally now. Right? Like I think, especially early on, you probably have a preference for using local police over your sort of raising your own police force, kind of like you see in Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong sort of famously has its own police force that is separate from the Chinese police force. And in China, there's sort of a single police force nationwide, generally sort of a centralized thing that's sort of devolved across provinces and municipalities, but it's all goes up to one commander eventually, right? with the exception of police forces in Hong Kong and Macau. So in theory, a ZEDE could do something similar, right? But exactly like China as well, like the Hong Kong example, Hong Kong does not have its own military. It's an integral part of China that relies on Chinese foreign policy and security, right? So fundamentally, that would be a sort of similar situation for a ZEDE that it would face as well, even if a ZEDE does have the choice to have its own sort of security system of our own police force.
Cool. And what other really out there things you can do in a ZEDE that you can't do in other special economic zones, for example, or that you couldn't do before the ZEDEs? Like what things that are usually up for governments, like in the traditional sense, you can do in a ZEDE, and what you can't do. And I'm thinking specifically about criminal law and things like that. But yeah, like why would someone wanna
Sure.
create that?
I can start on that. The big picture way in which I think the ZEDE law is different from most special economic zones is that it's a jurisdiction that can essentially make its own laws, make its own decisions, whereas most special jurisdictions maybe they can do a little bit of that at the margins. Some special economic zones, maybe they can play around a little bit with maybe what the tax policy is, or what regulatory relief they can offer, what sort of customs clearances they can offer, other different more sort of marginal policy instruments, but they're fairly constrained by the framework which they're operating under. And in some cases, maybe it's not even the individual zones themselves that are making those decisions, but maybe it's a central zone authority, or something like that. So with the ZEDEs, that's not really what we're dealing with here. There's sort of a high level framework that sort of sets some parameters and guidelines, but generally speaking, ZEDEs have a lot of freedom to make policy as they see fit. So like I said, you mentioned criminal justice. That's an area that I think we've seen some of the ZEDEs that do exist take an interest in, just because crime is an issue in Honduras, and if for most people, ordinary people, you might not really have a lot of recourse to be able to deal with that in your life, either whether it's with the courts or with the police or whatever it is. And so we've seen that as sort of a selling point from some of the ZEDEs, that within the jurisdiction that we're creating, there sort of will be rule of law and public order, and you can expect a reliability of those things and a certain level of safety. But this extends into other areas, all kinds of other areas as well. And we've seen some of the existing ZEDEs come up with lots of different policy systems. So for example, Prospera, one of the existing ZEDEs, they basically said, great, you want to incorporate a business here. You can essentially choose the sort of regulatory framework sort of under which your business is regulated. So if you want to operate within Prospera ZEDE under U.S. law, or UK law, or Canadian law, or Honduran law, and I think they specify actually they'll accept any OECD country. Fine, you can do that, and you'll be sort of regulated accordingly. We've seen with some of the other ZEDEs, they've sort of set requirements. X percentage of the workforce must be local Hondurans, or the minimum wage in this jurisdiction will be 10% above or 20% above whatever the Honduran prevailing minimum wage is. So we've seen these zones kind of take this authority in a lot of directions, in some sense, kind of either deregulatory, or just sort of taking a very sort of innovative, light touch kind of approach. Whereas in some other cases, they've kind of tried to, rather than shave away, beef up, elements of existing Honduran law, that they think are good, or that they want to expand on. So there's been a lot of experimentation, and there's very few areas in which the ZEDEs can't undertake that experimentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of to back up what Jeff has just discussed here, the law for the ZEDEs does sort of specify that a ZEDE can either adopt Honduran criminal law by reference, incorporate by reference, or it can adopt its own sort of criminal code, which, as Jeff has sort of discussed here. I guess in theory could be its own criminal code. I think, though, that's probably generally not preferred. And so, like I said, as Jeff has said there, incorporate by reference a criminal code from another jurisdiction.
Oh, yeah. So it's a government in a way, but it still has some very nice elements of private law where you can choose your own choice of law. I guess you can also choose choice of venue for disputes, no? Like you can
Yeah.
outsource Delaware.
A broad degree of freedom.
Nice. And so let's talk a bit about the current ZEDEs that exist. If I'm not wrong, there's 3, right? Prospera, Ciudad Morazán, and Mariposa, I think. You know better. You tell me.
Orquídea, I believe, is the third one.
Orquídea, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I can sort of give a brief overview, of kind of what each is kind of focused on. So starting with that last one, Orchid or Orquídea. This one of the ZEDEs is probably closest to kind of a traditional, SEZ industrial park, kind of setup. They're pretty explicitly focused on agro processing and agricultural exports. The sort of 2 that are more, I think, in line with what people think of, when they think of, ZEDEs or charter cities, is Ciudad Morazán and Prospera. So Morazán, it's located on the Honduran mainland near Choloma, and this ZEDE is essentially marketed at, sort of the average Honduran, essentially saying, look, we're building affordable housing. We're going to create good jobs. You can come here. It will be, safe. We're going to have good quality public services, schools, good urban planning, this sort of thing. And I believe to date, at least from some pictures and things that I've seen, it looks like there's at least, a couple dozen, if not maybe in the low hundreds, people living there now.
Okay.
I've seen some pictures of a couple sort of streets worth of housing that's been built, and I believe there's sort of some, light industrial logistics type, employment opportunities that are there, and they're going to continue to try to expand on those. So that's Morazán, and then the one that I think most people have probably heard of, is Prospera. So this is in the island of Roatan on, the Caribbean side of Honduras. And essentially, Prospera, I think, is, whereas Morazán is kind of focused on some of these sort of traditional kind of industrial activities. Prospera is much more focused on, sort of tech, innovation, fintech, financial innovation, as well as tourism and some other types of sort of high tech, and innovative manufacturing.
Like health tourism, for example.
Yeah. So it's a little bit more, I would say, of sort of an international focus, targeting both Hondurans as well as folks from abroad. To that end, I think they're doing like an e-residency program for people who want to sort of take advantage of their business environment. And they've sort of made similar progress. I believe the figure I saw is that there's about 1,100 people working in Prospera in some capacity, and I suspect maybe probably a couple hundred of them are actively living within the bounds of the jurisdiction. But that seems to be progressing well. I think they're starting to host. I think coming up, I think it's actually tomorrow. They're hosting an international conference. They're starting to host events. Do these other types of activities. I continually see like on social media different job postings for companies that are operating within Prospera. So progress, seems to be going well there. Although of course all of this is kind of overshadowed by the government having repealed the ZEDE law in April of this year. I'm not sure if you wanted to get into that just yet.
Well, yes. Yeah.
Sure.
Although I have a question. I mean,
Yes.
one of your co-authors who wasn't able to be here
Mhm.
today, she wanted to talk about how is life living. Well, how is living in Prospera? Do you have any information on that? Have you been there, by the way?
I have not, and Carl, he has not either. I think we both love to get down there at some point. It seems very nice from the pictures that I've seen and conversations I've had with some folks who are either working there or who are involved in some way. So seems very nice, but can't speak to it personally.
Yeah, certainly there's a couple of conferences happening there in November of this year. I'd love to go. I'm gonna see if I can clear my schedule to go to one of these conferences. I think unfortunately it's dependent on my work schedule with other portfolios. So hopefully I can go this year, and if not, certainly I plan to next year.
Nice. Okay, so to go into the topic that you're mentioning, yeah, so what is happening in that regards?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so for a long time, right, the ZEDE law, like we said, was passed sort of in 2012, became operational kind of in 2013. And for a long time has been very controversial in Honduras, kind of from the get-go. Right, there was sort of these constitutional issues that made a lot of people, I think, upset. They're sort of a matter of the actual sort of legitimacy of the project itself, but also of the government that put the ZEDE law into place. There was what has been described as a coup in the years preceding when the ZEDE law was adopted. So there's kind of this, understanding by a lot of people that maybe the government that put the party that put the ZEDE law in place, maybe should not have been in power. And then there's this constitutional sort of issue that arises. So the project kind of gets off on this sort of rocky footing. And sort of the initial oversight committee for the ZEDEs has a lot of sort of very ideological and sort of maybe questionable choices of members who are kind of on this oversight board initially for the ZEDEs. And there are these sort of stories that come out about the ZEDEs, they're going to appropriate land, or they're going to target indigenous community land. And there's just kind of this continual snowball of negative press and negative stories related to the ZEDEs. And there's kind of this, several year period of inaction where, these kind of reports are happening, but no real progress is kind of being made anyway. But then in 2017, so we get the first ZEDE established properly. What would eventually become Prospera really kind of becomes active in say, I would say 2019, which is kind of around the same time that Morazan becomes active as well. And there's sort of some continuing issues that go on there. There's sort of some reports about sort of disputes between sort of Prospera and some of the local community there, and some of the local sort of police and political officials. Some things kind of go viral, and it's as they're making this progress, it's from a PR perspective, it's kind of ugly, it's kind of messy, and we've seen like even recently, I think maybe a few weeks ago, there was like some vandalism and protests outside of Ciudad Morazan, for example. So there's been kind of this popular opposition to the ZEDEs, regardless of what has actually happened on the ground. None of the ZEDEs have ever actually expropriated any land. None of them ever tried to. Yet this is kind of this prevailing narrative. So it sort of created this very rocky political foundation, which the sort of entire ZEDE regime kind of rests on. And then last year, when the opposition party won the most recent election, then the leader of this party is the wife of the previous president, who was ousted when the party that passed the ZEDEs came into power. And one of her sort of signature campaign pledges was, we're going to get rid of the ZEDEs. They were associated with Juan Orlando Hernandez, the outgoing president who ended up getting extradited to the U.S. on drug trafficking charges. So there's this whole maelstrom of issues, and so this finally comes to a head in April of 2022. They get the votes in place in the Congress, and the law ends up getting repealed unanimously. But that doesn't necessarily mean the end of the ZEDEs, instantly. We're now kind of in this weird limbo period where the government has repealed the law, but as a result of some different legal stability agreements, some different investment protection treaties, free trade agreements, to which Honduras is a party to, in theory, they should be able to essentially continue, even in the absence of the law, for a period of roughly 50 years. That is protected in a web of these kind of agreements that exist. And a couple people we've kind of spoken to about this basically say it would essentially be a certainty that if the government tried to shut the ZEDEs down or take the land back or anything like that, it would go to arbitration, and the government would almost certainly lose. And because there's kind of been this threat of maybe this happening, we've even seen now, like, for example, some members of Congress in the U.S. have issued some letters, basically saying, look, Honduran government, you need to respect these agreements. There are U.S. investments in these zones, and if these investments are either literally or through sort of regulatory taking, expropriated, we're going to use the full power of these laws in place to crack down on that and cut off aid and these kind of things. So there's this sort of limbo now where the government wants to be able, I think, to say, we did it, the ZEDEs are gone, they're dead, but their hands are also tied, because if they actually affirmatively do something to really put the knife in the ZEDEs, they will almost certainly lose in international court, and it will be very bad economically for Honduras. And so this is sort of the battle the ZEDEs are fighting right now, saying, the law is on our side. International agreements to which Honduras is a member, this is all on our side. We should be able to sort of continue our business under the regime, that previously existed. And it seems like the best case scenario now would be for there to be some sort of settlement reached, where the government can sort of take a victory lap and say, we did it, we got rid of the ZEDEs, but kind of puts this uncertainty to rest, and the ZEDEs, the three that exist, sort of can continue their business unmolested. And that's kind of the limbo that we find ourselves in.
Okay, so in that scenario, the three that exist would continue to exist, but no new ZEDEs could start. Interesting. And you mentioned expropriation, and that is a controversy or it's one of the reasons why Honduran people, or some of them, don't support the ZEDE framework. And it was also a topic that you touched on your paper. So can you talk a bit about the expropriation topic and what safeguards were put in place, or if they were not, in the ZEDE framework to prevent or to simply address that possibility?
Sure. So on this point, before getting into the law itself, it's worth noting that both Prospera and Ciudad Morazan have issued a number of statements and legal documents saying, look, we are not going to be expropriating land. If we want more land, essentially, we're going to buy it, at market price. They've had enough, I think, PR issues for a lifetime. They certainly don't want to do that. And, I genuinely believe that, so the people involved, generally wouldn't want to go that route anyway. I think they would want to, if they want to expand their territory, acquire land, fairly, honestly, and through the market. And I believe recently there's a Human Rights Commission within the Honduran government, and I believe it was Prospera, basically, or someone submitted to them, can you investigate, have the ZEDEs expropriated any land or anything? And the government was forced to admit no. That's never been done. It's never been attempted. There's no outstanding sort of actual claims of that.
And could a ZEDE potentially expropriate based on the current legal framework?
So under the law itself, the ZEDE doesn't actually have any power to do that. The way the law was written, and there's some specifics about if a zone is in a rural or a more urban area, there's some different kind of rules around this. But essentially, any sort of expropriation powers as they relate to ZEDEs rest with the government of Honduras, not the ZEDE itself. So, Morazan or Prospera couldn't go out tomorrow and, we want, this 100-acre parcel next door. We're going to initiate a process to take that. They can't do that. The government of Honduras would have to initiate that process.
Yeah, Jeff is correct here. Yeah, just going to say that in Chapter 4 of the law, in Article 25, it requires that if the government chooses to expropriate any land for ZEDE, that fair compensation has to be paid for that. Ultimately, what is fair compensation? I don't know if Honduran courts have already sort of defined that, or if there's law that defines that, or if that have to be a decision that be made there. But Jeff is completely correct in what he said there, that the ZEDEs themselves don't have any power to expropriate on their own.
Got it. It's kind of silly that, even bordering stupid, that they let that go into the final text of the law, because that was clearly going to come to bite where that people don't, you don't do that. So yeah.
I mean, yeah, certainly I think, issues of expropriation, or you might, in the US, you might call like eminent domain, are always very, very controversial. There's a great case in the US that happened where a local jurisdiction, a local government basically used eminent domain law expropriation to expropriate effectively a bunch of privately owned houses, an entire neighborhood. in order to level it for, I think, if I remember correctly, the building of a pharmaceutical factory that never happened ultimately. So this is very controversial. This case went to the Supreme Court, and ultimately the landowners, the homeowners lost. The land was expropriated. The houses were leveled, and then nothing ended up being built as part of this redevelopment project. So I mean that's one example from the U.S. in terms of the controversial nature of expropriation, and so I think that kind of no matter the country that happens in, these are always like very touchy issues. Certainly in some countries like South Korea, where there's sort of regularized government-led redevelopment, it might be like less controversial. But even in countries like China, where the state theoretically owns all of the land and is just leasing the land for long-term leases, these are still very controversial things to do, and there are a number of cases in China with places called nail houses, right? Like a nail stuck in a board, where the resident refused to leave the house, and you'll see construction happening all around them, and there's even a really famous case in Seattle where a large building was built around a house, and if you still I don't know, I used to live in Seattle, I don't know if it's still the case, but you used to be able to bike down the Burke-Gilman Trail past this house that was basically in the corner of a supermarket. So it's certainly in terms of whether it's Honduras or any other country, issues of expropriation it was very, very touchy issues.
Yeah, especially in a country that suffered from colonization, where the relation between landowners and where there's a very particular relation to land and land ownership, and that was not clever for people to put that in the framework. Especially in projects that are seen as possible enclaves by foreigners.
Absolutely. And but to offer sort of the counterposition, though, the law does explicitly protect indigenous groups, right? If I remember correctly, the Garifuna are an indigenous group in Honduras along the coastal area, if I'm correct, that are sort of explicitly protected in the law. If I remember correctly, I don't know if it's in the Constitution or if it's in the text of the law itself. But in addition to that, there are some international legal issues that the ZEDE Law touches on, and one of those is the rights of indigenous peoples. So the ZEDE Law, even if the three of us are sort of agree that issues of expropriation were maybe not handled as delicately as they could be, the ZEDE Law certainly did take efforts to protect indigenous peoples and their rights to land. As Jeff sort of mentioned earlier, there's even parts of the law that discuss how, based on population density, maybe a ZEDE would require a majority vote in a plebiscite in order to be able to be incorporated. So there's a number of protections in the now former ZEDE Law that took pains to sort of protect the rights of indigenous peoples and any individual, any person within an area that would be turned into a ZEDE. So it's not that there were not efforts and measures taken to protect property or to protect the rights of individuals or minority groups, but maybe it wasn't done correctly. It wasn't done well enough, which I think is something that if any listeners are interested in creating a sort of special jurisdiction law, is something that certainly needs to be paid attention to. And maybe the best way to go about that is during the drafting of the law and the passage of the law to have the support of indigenous groups, right? And if I understand in your latest issue of JSJ, you even have an article on a special jurisdiction with a Native American group in the United States, and I think this is sort of maybe a counterexample to Honduras, where in Honduras, if there's concern over expropriation of land from indigenous people or peoples, who have been victimized by colonization. In the U.S., there's certainly a case of a special jurisdiction being used by the native people to their advantage, in terms of both seeking a business advantage and maybe even sort of exercising, the degree of sovereignty they have under the United States Constitution.
Exactly. You could have not said it better. And if I could summarize one single thing that I've learned in my career about what determines the success of a special jurisdiction and or not, is ensuring that the local community benefits first and foremost. Like you have that, you build that delicately, you're really, really careful with how you do that, how you ensure that, how when you are doing like the nested framework of the legal structure and you deal with other stakeholders, you really align all those things and consider the past, the future, and integrate them very well into the present, which is it's complicated, but it's possible. Like you're on a really, really, really good path. And that is something that the project here in the US with the Native Americans, with the Catawba in the Carolinas is definitely doing, yeah. And it's a shame that this expropriation topic made it like that to the ZEDE, because I think the framework has so much potential. Like you start talking about it at the beginning of your paper. It could be really, or could have, hopefully could be really transformative for Honduras.
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly can't really comment on the political, context in Honduras and how Hondurans feel about it. I will say though that certainly special jurisdictions can be a very interesting, useful tool for developing and testing new policies that sort of keep bad policies from being implemented across an entire country, and sort of restrict it to a single area to experiment with them and provide a great laboratory where if a good policy is found, it can be extended with the knowledge that it's a good policy already, right? It's not like you're experimenting on your entire country. So special jurisdictions to me are just very interesting tools to use, and it's certainly my hope, regardless of the political party that's in charge of any country, that special jurisdiction is used in a manner that seeks to conduct systematic experiments in governance with an aim to benefit the most people possible, especially the poorest people, the most vulnerable people, the people that have the farthest to go up. Special jurisdictions are certainly a tool that can be used for them and to their benefit. And certainly that's my hope as other countries and territories are looking at potentially trying a special jurisdiction. It's my hope that they do it in a manner that is beneficial to people who need to benefit. Hopefully, turning outside investment to the advantage of those who need it.
I love it. Completely agree with you, Carl. Completely. And I want to end on that really beautiful high note. Unless Jeffrey, you have an even nicer, more beautiful note to say. That was perfect. Yeah, completely agree with you, Carl. And thank you so much, Jeffrey and Carl, for joining me today in this episode, the third episode of the journal, or the second, third or second. I'm liking a lot of this conversation, so I might do it the first. Okay, we'll see. We'll do it randomly. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me in this episode of the Journal of Special Jurisdictions. And if anybody can take some time, which I totally advise that you do, to read the paper, we're going to put the link here. And thank you so much. And thank you so much, both of you, for writing it and sharing such a comprehensive, all-encompassing, finalized document.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much. We appreciate it.